My granddad passed away about 8 months ago, and it still feels surreal. Growing up, I spent every summer at his house, as my mom didn't want to hire a babysitter while school was out. I got to swim and fish in the lake behind his home, a perfect arrangement. Each summer, he had new activities planned. Sometimes we'd experiment with different fishing techniques, and other years we'd go deer hunting in the rolling fields of his nearly 80-acre property. It felt like endless space to explore as a kid. One summer, we dedicated almost 2 whole months to building a treehouse overlooking the lake. Amazingly, neither of us fell out and got hurt. The summer before he passed, we started making plans for a deck that would extend over the lake, perfect for fishing right off the side. I was thrilled. My parents practically had to drag me back home. But the deck was never built. That winter, my granddad began having issues, calling my mom late at night, confused about things that didn't make sense. She often managed to calm him down, but once it got so bad that she had to drive out to his place at night and stay for a few days. Sadly, he only got worse. Neighbors found him wandering in the woods in his nightgown, unable to find his way home. By spring, it was clear he couldn't live alone anymore, and despite his protests, my mom moved him into an assisted living facility just a few minutes from us. I visited him regularly, and for a while, he was happy to see us, but then he became increasingly confused. It all happened so fast. One day we were fishing and listening to Hank Williams, and the next, he was just a shell of himself. He lived in that care facility for about 5 years, longer than the doctors had predicted. In the end, I wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. He passed just a few days shy of his 70th birthday. We held a small memorial at his house, and my mom and I spent time cleaning and fixing things in preparation. After sitting empty for 5 years, the place was still in decent shape. After the service, I went out to the lake and stood there alone for a while. It was only a couple of 100 feet across, but it felt so much larger when I was a kid. A few days later, I was shocked to discover in his will that he had left me the house and land. He'd written it just a couple of months before my last summer with him. I could sense my aunt's barely concealed envy, but my mom was happy for me. She even offered to help me fix up the house and cover the moving costs if I decided to move in. But I wasn't ready. I still had school to finish, and I suspected there was more work to do on the property than it appeared. Yet every week, I drove up to do a little more, clearing dead trees, replacing the warped siding, and laying fresh gravel in the driveway. Progress was slow, but I felt like I was getting closer. Then, a few months ago, while clearing out the garage, I stumbled upon some rough blueprints spread out on my granddad's old workbench. They were for the lake dock, the big project we never completed. I felt a wave of emotion looking over them. They were almost complete, just missing a few measurements. In that moment, I decided I would build the dock myself as a final tribute to him. I bought most of the lumber and tools the following week, along with a depth gauge to get the final measurements for the posts that would go into the lake. If it was deeper than about 15 feet, I'd probably have to use anchors, but I decided to stick to the original plans. The next weekend, I borrowed a friend's pickup truck to bring everything out in one trip. I packed food, water, and essentials, thinking it would be easier to stay out there for a few days instead of making the drive back and forth. With enough of my granddad's furniture still around, I could make short stays comfortable. The first thing I did was take the depth measurements I needed. I hauled the old boat down to the overgrown shore of the lake, hoping it would stay afloat long enough for me to get the readings. The depth gauge looked simple enough, like a flashlight that uses a laser to measure the distance to the bottom. Thankfully, the boat didn't have any major leaks. I climbed aboard and rowed out about 30 feet to where the end of the dock would be. I uncapped the depth gauge, plunged it into the water, flipped the switch, and nothing. The display kept flashing, but it wouldn't give me a reading. I spent what felt like ages trying to get the depth meter to work, but after a moment, it would always just error out and turn off. After a few more failed attempts, I decided to head to the hardware store instead. Luckily, there was a small one nearby, so I didn't have to go all the way back into town. I bought an old-fashioned water depth meter, Essentially a weighted line that could be spooled out until it reached the bottom, a simple measuring tape with a hunk of metal at the end. In hindsight, it was probably what I should have gotten from the start. Back at the house, I rowed out onto the lake again and dropped the weight into the water, watching it sink. But strangely, it just kept going, unspooling farther and farther. 15 feet, 30, 50, I could hardly believe it. Finally, it stopped, not because it had reached the bottom, but because I'd run out of line at 100 feet. That couldn't be right. I had never reached the bottom as a kid, but I was certain the lake wasn't that deep. I reeled the line back in and tried again, thinking I might get a different result. But once again, the line only stopped because there was no more to give. I just stood there, scratching my head, unsure what to make of it. Should I get a longer line? Even if I reached the bottom, what would I find? While mulling it over, the depth meter slipped from my hands and fell into the lake, sinking instantly. There went $30, I thought, frustrated. I sat back in the boat, searching my phone for answers. 15 minutes later, a sudden jolt nearly caused me to lose my only oar. It felt like a brief earthquake, and ripples started moving across the lake from all sides. Before I could process what had happened, there was a loud splash nearby, drenching me in dark lake water. Something had shot out of the lake, nearly hitting me as it landed back on the boat with a heavy thud. I cautiously opened one eye, half expecting the boat to be moving, only to realize I was just trembling. At my feet lay the metal weight from the depth meter, attached to a few feet of frayed line that looked battered and twisted. I rowed to shore faster than I'd ever rowed before. When I reached solid ground, I took a moment to catch my breath and looked back. The lake was calm, the sun beginning to set over the glassy surface, as if nothing strange had happened. I was bewildered and disturbed. What on earth was going on? After drying off, I changed into my pajamas and sat by the back door, staring out at the lake. Part of me wanted to just drive off, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I waited, watching the surface, every ripple or splash from a dragonfly or frog making me jump. Logical explanations started creeping in, telling me maybe I had imagined it all, or that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. But each time I glanced at the frayed line on the kitchen counter, doubt gnawed at me. Hours passed, and as my eyelids grew heavy, I finally drifted into a restless sleep filled with haunting dreams I couldn't remember, but left me drenched in sweat. I woke with a start, almost falling out of my chair. The lake, silent and serene under the twilight, looked perfectly normal. Maybe it had all been a dream, or maybe there was some massive underwater creature, a notion that seemed almost laughable. But then, a faint light caught my eye outside. The lake had started to glow with an eerie blue-green light. Gentle waves spread from its center, growing faster, and a strange hum filled the air, accompanied by a pressure that felt like being on an airplane. I tried to grab my car keys and leave, but my legs wouldn't move. The lake rose up, forming a dome of swirling water and pulsating light, looming above the house and trees. Finally, I managed to stand, but the relief was short-lived as my legs began moving of their own accord toward the lake. Soon, I felt damp grass beneath my feet, the mist chilling my skin, and I couldn't even blink. The dome of water held a massive, coiled shape within, about 50 feet across, with ringed appendages twitching around it like a cat's tail. The brightest part of the light shone down on me, casting an intense spotlight. I might have screamed, I think I did, as I continued walking, extending my hand toward the mass. The voice in my head grew louder than my own thoughts. "Come in," it urged. "He's already here. I've seen you in his memories." I kept walking, embraced the inevitable, and then. The next thing I knew, I was in an unfamiliar house, one of the neighbors' places, I later found out. He said he'd found me wandering in the woods, soaked to the skin, which apparently gave him a strange sense of déjà vu. He'd once found my grandfather like that too. My mother showed up an hour later to take me home, her face unreadable as we drove in silence. The next few weeks were filled with tests and scans, specialists, and more questions. They all said the same thing: nothing was physically wrong, but they'd need to run more tests. It was almost funny, but I knew my mother found no humor in it. Meanwhile, I keep feeling myself slipping, fading somehow. It's hard for me to think clearly, and sometimes I feel like I'm dreaming, even when I'm awake. I've been forgetting things, little details, mostly, but they're starting to overshadow even my fondest memories of my grandfather, which are becoming hazy and blurred. I can still feel the remnants of joy when I focus on them, but the details are getting harder and harder to grasp. So I've decided to write all of this down before it fades completely. I don't know what's out there in that lake. My mother says she's selling the place and insists I shouldn't leave the house without her, at least not until I'm feeling better. But somehow, I just know that eventually, I'll be back at the lake.